Today is Thursday, November 4th, and this is William and Dania Michael. This is our third podcast episode, talking together about the practical details of family life and homeschooling. And in our first episode, we talked a bit about our family schedule and what the kids do in their studies. Dania talked about what she does with the kids during the day. And we've got a number of responses from Catholic parents who were interested in those practical details and were asking us to get into that kind of stuff in more detail, details about schedules and what the kids actually do specifically in different subjects and studies, what we actually do day to day practically. And we're going to get into that. We're going to get into all of those details because I think that what's helpful is for us to actually talk practical and not just spend a lot of time talking about vague general ideas or saying what we think others should do, but talking specifically about what we do, what we have done, and what our experiences have been. And as we started to think about how to get into these practical details, we said really it's not so much that we've focused on any specific practical details, but what's been most important for us through the years is being able to focus on a number of principles that always keep us focused and direct us in all of those practical details. And so we sat here for a little bit, brainstorming, making a list of 12 principles. Well, we started making a list of principles that through the years have helped us to get through all of the different challenges of parenting and homeschooling. And as we put a list together, we came up with 12 principles, 12 things that we always go back to as the principles that guide all of the practical details. And I think if we talk about these principles, the practical details will make more sense when we get into the practical details. And the reason why principles are important is because there's always change in family life. There's all kinds of things that come and happen and change, and all sorts of things out of our control, but the principles always stay the same. The principles always allow us to get back to the center, back on task, back focused. And they help us through difficult times when there's a lot of confusion and complexity. The principles are like lights that help us through those confusing times. And so what I'd like to do is to go through tonight these principles that we have personally followed through the years that have helped us with the practical details of family life and homeschooling. So I'm going to introduce each one of these principles and then let Dania talk about the details of it. And we'll try to move through these because, like I said, there's 12 of them. And even if we spent 5 minutes on each one, it would be an hour-long discussion. So we're going to move through these, and in future talks, we can always dig into individual principles in more detail. And as we talk about the practical details of household life and homeschooling and parenting, you're going to hear these principles all the time through all of those discussions. So I'd like to just give an overview of them tonight, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we'll title this talk something like Principles for Parenting or Principles for Family Life, and we'll simply fly through them in our talk tonight. So the first one that we'll talk about, and these are in no specific order, we just were brainstorming and listing them as they came to mind. So we're just going to go through them in the order that we wrote them down. The first one is based on an old saying that we came across when we were first married. And the saying was, "Duty done is fireside to the soul." Duty done is fireside to the soul. So Dania, why don't you take a few minutes and explain what this saying means to us in family life and how it's affected the practical details of our family life.
Okay, well, if you think of a fireside, like tonight is the first night of the year. It's November, it's a chilly night. It's the first night of the year we put a fire on. And for our whole family, everybody got together. Everyone was so excited. The kids get all the wood and the sticks, and everyone's so excited for the fire to be on because it's just comforting. The whole house is warm, and it brings a different atmosphere in the house. So fireside, when you think of that, it's just comfort. And it's at the end of the day of work, and it's at the end of the day of a long day of work, and it's comforting for the whole family. So when you think of fireside to the soul, you get this image of just comfort and peace for your soul. And what it means is that doing your duty, doing the things that are necessary for you in whatever circumstance of life that you're in, is just as that comfort is to your body of a fire, that's how it is for your soul. So doing our duty, whatever it is, me as a wife, doing my duty is to love my husband, to love my children, to be a homemaker. That is fireside to my soul. When I go to bed at night, I know everything is done if I've done those things. Other things can be done, the house can be messy, other things can be done, but if I've done those things, I'm at peace. And so each of us in our family has our own duties. And if we fulfill our duties in that day, we can go to sleep at night with that type of peace.
Yeah, and explain how, what do we see in other families as alternatives to that? Explain why that saying was significant for us in our life. Can you talk about that? Well, what we see in other families is there's always these attempts to try and have vacations, find activities to do, find things like family fun, family. Make everybody feel happy. There's all these efforts to try and make people feel good and make good family memories and things like that. But that saying, "Duty done is fireside to the soul," was our commitment as a family. That we weren't going to try to please ourselves with all kinds of artificial activities, all kinds of running around, trying to have vacations and things like that. We were going to make our peace.
Our home a vacation every day. Feel like a vacation and be
Family
peaceful.
life was going to be our vacation, was going to be a peaceful house. All of our duties done, a responsible life. Go to bed at night with a good conscience. Duty done is fireside to the soul. So that was one of the first principles early on when we first started having kids that we committed to. And we're a family that stays home. Our kids, one of the keys to our family's daily schedule is that we're just home. The routine is the same day by day. We're not running around. We're not trying to find social activities. We're not trying to hang out with friends. We're not trying to go on trips or vacations. We stay put, and we try to have our source of comfort and peace be the fact that our duties are done. And duty done is fireside to the soul was one of the most influential principles for us in getting our family started. The second one, and again, these are in no specific order. We just wrote them down as we thought about them. The second principle that we practiced through the years that's actually proven to be extremely helpful, especially now, is to focus on the oldest child. And I always told Dania that we need to focus on our oldest child. And that was Jonathan growing up. I said, if we focus on the oldest child, everything that we invest in him will trickle down and affect the other kids. So Day, why don't you talk about how that principle guided us through the years and how it's working out now and actually helping us not only with Jonathan's influence, but with other older kids as well. Why don't you talk about what it means to focus on the eldest?
Well, ever since the kids were little, you would always just tell me, focus on Jonathan. Focus on Jonathan, and Jonathan will lead the way with the other kids. And as we were raising Jonathan, I focused my attention on him, on his schooling, on his formation, on his development. Everything was focused on him. And the other kids kind of just followed along with what I was doing with Jonathan. Yes, I had attention on them. Yes, I did things with them, but he was always the focus. And that happened. There's so many times I saw that blessed. I mean, for instance, like when I was teaching Jonathan to read, Elizabeth sat at the table. She was a year and a half younger than him, and she sat at the table, and she learned to read just by being at the table while I taught Jonathan. And that's how it worked throughout the whole time. I would focus on Jonathan, and the other kids would be in the room listening, and they learned so much of their lessons just through listening to Jonathan. And then since that's gotten older, we had normal trouble with kids being bad and all of that. But as Jonathan's gotten older, he's made a lot of good decisions, and then the pressure has been on the other kids to follow him now, because he's set this mark that now they have to reach toward. And so he's set the way and paved the way as he's made good choices as he's gotten older, and they kind of follow suit. And now, right now, we have 7 kids at home. So now my oldest to focus on is Mary. And so Mary is the focus, and she now has set the path for the other kids. As I've worked with her more than everybody else, if she comes to me, I drop everything and work with Mary. And now she and her is starting to get zealous, and now she's setting the path for the other kids. So now I have Samuel, Jacob, and Joshua seeing her starting to get zealous, and now that's put pressure on them, and they've started to want to work more. And now she's setting the path for the whole family as she's the oldest. So I've seen this really be effective in the last 20 years. It just has helped.
Yeah, and it's important to also mention that it's not just when Jonathan has made good decisions, but also
bad decisions too.
When Jonathan has made bad decisions. The kids have seen us telling him what to do, warning him of the dangers, him not listening, and then going and paying the penalty for it.
Right.
And so, they've seen both good and bad. We've always focused on Jonathan through the years, and our relationship to him as our firstborn son has sort of taught every moral lesson to the younger children as they've watched that relationship through the years.
Yeah.
We've always focused on Jonathan. And just so you know, Jonathan is now in college. He's doing great. He's in the ROTC program, studying to be an officer in the military. His tuition is paid, getting good grades in college, living independently, and pressuring his younger brothers and sisters every time that he talks to them or stops home, pressuring them to listen to mom and dad, do their schoolwork, and take life seriously. So focusing on the eldest, and like Dania said, not just on the oldest kid, but also on the oldest kid who's home when the adult kids start heading off and getting their lives started, continuing to focus on the eldest. And now Mary is doing great. Was there something else you wanted to say?
I do. I want to say something else, because what I see a lot of mothers do now, as the older kids get older, it becomes more difficult to parent them. And I see a lot of mothers start neglecting the older ones, kind of giving up on them and focusing their attention and delighting in their babies, which is the opposite of what we're saying to do. Because babies are easy, and you can start focusing on them, start nursing them more, start devoting more time to this little individual specific care of babies and leave off the older ones. And it's tempting to do that because it's easier. You can put all your hope in this other little one who you have no idea what they're going to be as they get older. And you leave your focus off the older ones and kind of let them go and just kind of give up on them.
And the other thing too is if the older kids become really bad and evil, you're going to have so much evil influence on the younger kids that you're never going to control that influence. And that's why focusing on the eldest is really so important, because the eldest cannot be allowed to become a terrible influence on the other kids. They have to see the older brother or older sister. They have to see that older brother or sister as a good example. And when the older brother or sister does something bad, they have to see the consequences for that and learn. Focusing on the eldest, avoiding that temptation to choose to spend your time with the babies and just ignore the older ones. That's been a principle through the years that we've always focused on and has always produced good fruit for us. And now, like I've said before, we had trouble. Some families have trouble with homeschooling because the kids resist it and it's uncomfortable. They get pressure from family, things like that. We had that pressure when Jonathan and Elizabeth and David were coming up because they were our first children. We were the only people in our family that homeschool. We had all these criticisms from outside of our home and from inside of our home, from the older kids, because they had expectations that they would be discriminated against because of homeschooling. And what they found when they went into the workplace, when they went into the military, when they went to college, was exactly the opposite. They found that there was no discrimination at all, and they were actually shocked at how well things like a homeschool diploma and the education that we gave them were received by the military, by colleges, and so on. And now, by focusing on those oldest kids and having good results with them, we don't hear a peep from our younger kids about homeschooling. There is never any resistance to homeschooling among our younger kids. It's just taken as normal everyday life, and it is what it is. And they've already seen it works. It worked for John, it worked for Liz, it's working for Dave, and now it's just their turn. So that second principle, focusing on the eldest, has definitely been a key for us and has been very fruitful through the years. The third principle that we wrote down here was to focus on the precepts of the church. And this one's probably going to be a little controversial. Focusing on the precepts of the church. And Daniel, why don't you talk a little bit about what we mean by focusing on the precepts of the church?
Well, we mean not adding in other rules or things that would burden the kids. The church is actually when you look at the precepts of the church, it's actually very easy. And you can kind of feel like you want more. You want the church to tell you to do more. And the precepts of the church are very simple, that they can be kept by us. And so we don't add in anything extra. We just tell the kids to focus on the precepts of the church, and that's what we ask of them.
Yeah, and so if you think through the precepts of the church, the focus is on going to Sunday Mass, going to Mass on holy days of obligation, making confession. The precept of the church is to make confession once a year. And what we try to do is we try to stay positive. If we make confession once a year, we fulfilled the precept of the church. And everything beyond that should be treated positively. If we go to confession 3 times a year, we've gone 3 times as much as the precepts of the church require us to go. And it should be positive. If we could go more than that, great. It's positive. And by keeping a focus on the precepts of the church, we make religion positive. It's not hard for anyone to keep the precepts of the church. It's not hard for the children. They consider it reasonable to keep the precepts of the church. But once you go beyond that and start making strict devotional practices, for example, we like to pray the Liturgy of the Hours. We like routine prayer. My wife likes to pray the Rosary. I like to study theology and study sacred scripture. I talk and think about theology 24 hours a day. That's my own devotional life. That's my wife's own devotional life. And we have graces and experience as Christians that have made us appreciate those things and desire those things. And our children haven't shared in those experiences. They haven't shared in the lessons that we've learned through the years, and they don't understand why we desire to do certain things we do. So even when we pray, one error that we made early on was that we tried to really press devotional activities on the kids and make them participate and things like that. And after a while, we just realized that causes more harm than good. It's no one's requiring those things of the kids. And if we would just focus on the precepts of the church and maintain a positive attitude towards religion and realize that in order for the kids to embrace more devout practices, they have to grow in grace, and that's not something that's in our control. And we're going to focus on the things that are in our control, And we're going to try to keep a positive spirit in the house with regard to religion. So we've always encouraged the kids to do more, invited the kids to do more, taught the kids how they can do more. But we've learned to not require the kids to do more and leave that for their own choosing. And you can just think about how Jesus taught people. Jesus came to teach a way of perfection. He came to teach perfection, to call men to religious vocations, to call men to celibacy for the kingdom of heaven. But he didn't demand that of everyone. He invited everyone to perfection. But for those who didn't choose to follow him in the way of perfection, everything remained positive. It was good for them to take their time and learn and pray and confess their sins and amend their lives little by little. But at the same time, he taught and demonstrated the way of perfection. And I think that model that Jesus gives us is continued in the church. The church does the same thing. If you want to learn the way of perfection, you can in the church. But the church doesn't preach it from the pulpit on Sunday or guilt everyone over it. The church maintains the precepts, deals with personal issues in confession and counseling. But if you want more, you can get it. And I think maintaining that simple focus on the precepts of the church and not overburdening the kids with religious pressures, especially when they don't have the grace needed for those devotional practices or disciplines. They just don't appreciate or understand them. And it's like asking them to make bricks with no straw. So the third principle is focusing on the precepts of the church and trying to stay positive and make religious practices voluntary among the kids. That's the third principle. The fourth, focusing on what's in our control, focusing on things that are in our control. And what I mean by that, I gave a walk talk that was titled Why Christian Education Should Focus on Philosophy and Not Theology. So if you want to get into this one in detail, I gave a whole walk talk on this topic, but we'll talk about it just a little bit. Focusing on what's in your control. Daniel, can you talk about that a little bit? What it means to focus on what's in our control as parents?
Okay, well, we can teach our kids virtues. For instance, I can read every day. We read the scripture reading with them. I can read Proverbs with them every day, and I can teach them the virtues. But for them to actually do it, that requires grace. That requires them to have faith from God, which is a gift He gives them. It requires them to have hope in His promises, and requires them to have love. So it requires them to be given spiritual virtues to actually do these things, and God has to give that to them in their gifts,
even to desire them.
Yeah, even to want them. Yeah. So my focus can be on what's in my control. I can teach them virtue and try to win them over. Like we read Aesop's fables every day, so they're learning about all these virtues and why it's good to be virtuous and it's foolish to be unvirtuous. They see the foolish characters and they just suffer when they're being selfish, or they just always have all these things where they suffer for not being virtuous. So they can see it's logical, they see it's reasonable to do these things. So that's the kind of things that we can focus on. But to actually do it, most of the things God has to give them the grace to actually will it and to want to do it.
Yeah, so there's just a lot of things in our children's lives. There's a lot of things that are not in our control. And I just want to say that if you look in the catechism, if you study the virtue of hope, when hope is described in the catechism, it explains that included in the grace of hope is a desire for heaven. And just think about that. If hope is a supernatural virtue infused into the soul by God, and in hope is the desire for heaven, you can't give a child a desire for heaven. And that's the foundation of everything in the Christian life, is a desire for heaven. Nothing makes sense without a desire for heaven. And that desire comes in and through the grace of hope We can't give the kids that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are duties for parents to fulfill, and those are the things that we can focus on. We can set a good example.
Mm-hmm.
We can have a good routine. We can form good habits. We can discipline and discourage bad habits.
Mm-hmm.
We can protect them from harmful behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But to go beyond that,
Mm-hmm.
they need grace. And
well, also things like we can pray with them. When we pray with them, they can see answered prayers, and
Mm-hmm.
just seeing prayers be answered, that gives them, that shows them that God is alive, God is working. I can see, you know what I mean. I can see the fruit of this.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that later when we get into the last of these principles, because that's going to come back. But focusing on what's in our control, understanding that we're not God. We're not the Holy Spirit. We don't have the power to cause our children to be born again. Those things are spiritual gifts that God alone can give, and he gives his spirit and his gifts differently to different people. This is what we learn in Romans chapter 9. We look at people in the Bible. Look at Isaac, his two sons, Jacob and Esau. Same father, same household, two completely different children. And God says, Jacob I have loved, and Esau I have hated. And St. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 9. But there's just things that we can do for our kids, and there are things we can't do for our kids, and we focus on those things that are in our control, focus on fulfilling our duties. So that's the fourth of these principles. Principle number 5 is that marriage is permanent and parenting is temporary. Marriage is permanent and parenting is temporary. And just to get this started, if we just think about our marriage vows, we take marriage vows till death do us part. The marriage relationship is a marriage until death. Parenting is not a relationship unto death. Parenting is a relationship until a child reaches adulthood. And then the child's free to make his own life choices and start his own adult life. And so, Dania, can you talk a little bit about how this principle that marriage is permanent and parenting is temporary relates to our dealings with the kids day by day in the house?
Well, it's just, simple in that the house is our house, and the kids are going to leave. And we just remind them of this all the time. Like, this is mom's and dad. This is dad's and mom's house. This is not your house. You're going to be leaving. So as much as the decisions that we make are ours, and the rules are our rules, and you will one day get to have your own household and get to have your own rules, and we'll see how that goes. We'll see, that's as simple as that.
Yeah, and this is where I come in a lot as dad, because for me, even more, this is my house. And so I'll have teenage boys who talk back to mom. And, I've talked about this in walk talks, but there's a scene in the Odyssey where Telemachus yells at his mother. He snaps back at his mother. Telemachus is Odysseus' son. And there's a scene where he snaps back at his mother, and that's the kind of thing that happens often in the house when teenage boys are living with their mother. All of a sudden, you've got these young men who are growing, and they're going to become independent heads of households. They're going to become independent men who make their own rules and run their own houses. And they're living with a woman, and they start to develop this independent spirit as they get into their teenage years. And it's a good thing. And that's why I brought up Telemachus, is because in the Odyssey, in the scene where Telemachus snaps at his mother and tells her to be quiet, everyone looks on, and it's an impressive scene because it's a sign that Telemachus is becoming a man and taking responsibility for the household while his father's away. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of pushback from boys is just part of becoming men. And what I've found through the years is that it's actually very reasonable, once I explain to the boys that this is my house, and that they may not agree with me about things that I do. They often don't understand why I do the things that I do. And that's irrelevant because this is my house. And they're obliged to keep the rules of my house until they're adults and they become independent. And then when they're independent, they're going to be allowed to have their own house, their own family, their own rules. And that's the appropriate time for that. That this is not the appropriate time for that. This is not the time for you to pretend you're an independent man because you're not. You're still living in my house, eating my food, dependent on me for provision. You're not an independent man, and you need to acknowledge that and be respectful in my house. And I find the boys have no problem understanding that and seeing that there's going to be a time for them to have their own way. And the other thing that I emphasize is their opinions and their ideas, they're going to pay for with their own money. And that's going to affect what ends up actually being their opinion or what they do, because they're going to have to pay for it and they're going to learn there's a reason we don't do those things. But that's part of growing up. Marriage is permanent. This is our house, husband and wife. We're going to be here when we're 60 years old. The children are not going to be here, just like I'm not in my parents' house, just like you're not in your parents' house. The kids are not going to be here. This is our house. And we focus on that principle, that marriage is permanent. And this parenting relationship with our kids is temporary. Not that our parenting relationship doesn't continue, but it changes when they become adults. So that's the fifth of these principles. The sixth principle that really is, I think, far more important than people realize is the importance of health and fitness. The importance of health and fitness. So why don't you talk a little bit about the role that health and fitness play in the life of our kids and how it affects all other aspects of family life and behavior for them.
Okay, well, we can start with food. I mean, food, we live a pretty temperate life. We usually eat 2 meals a day, maybe 1 meal a day sometimes. And the kids, it's usually very simple. We have a lot of just simple food. And so that's what our kids are. Our kids are not eating junk all the time. It's usually 2 meals. We don't eat outside of the meal time. And we just don't eat a lot of food, so that's one thing. And the second one...
simple food.
And what?
Simple food,
yeah,
too.
Simple food.
Even when we do eat simple.
Yeah, you do a lot of just focus on bread or potatoes or rice, and then just something to go with that. So it's a lot of simple food, and it's not a lot of food. And we don't eat it outside of meal times, very rarely. And the only time we really have any kind of desserts or anything fancy are for birthdays and holidays, and so it's very simple. So they're used to that life, and anytime we have a special holiday or a birthday or something comes up, it's very special to them. So they don't have a lot of sweets and things like that. And then fitness, every day we encourage them to run. So after school, they usually just run, do the exercise, they play games, they just run for about 2 hours a day, all of them. So they always are, well, the younger ones at least. Outside, yeah. So they're outside, and we live in the country, so it's healthy. There's a pond, there's a stream, but they spend a couple hours a day just running and exercising. Yeah, a couple hours.
At least 2 hours a day.
Yeah, that's on school days. When if we have extra time off, they'll have outside work days. So it could be raking leaves, it could be cleaning a barn, cleaning Grandma and Grandpa's barn. It could be, all kinds of stuff that they do outside. So they're always physical. They're always
always running, climbing.
When they get older, they have their job. Our older kids will have a job at an organic greenhouse around the block, or working for another neighbor who has a sawmill. But it's always just physical work, So they're just fit and
when they're in the house, they're calm because they get all their physical energy out in their work and in their play, and we provide lots of time for that. They're not looking to roughhouse in the house or bang around. People ask us at church how the kids are all so calm, and one of the reasons is they like to be able to sit down and relax because they work hard and they live a strenuous life with a lot of physical activity and exercise, and when it's time to sit down, they don't mind sitting down because they're tired and they got all their energy out, or they know they're going to get it out at recess time. And they've always been active and physically fit and strong. They camp out during the summer. We make them play outdoors at least 2 hours a day. They're outside all around, year round through all the seasons, learning outdoor skills, fishing, shooting guns, building stuff with whatever supplies they can find. And we just encourage them to be very physically active and to live a light and temperate life, so that they have both a temperate diet and a very physically active daily routine.
Well, one of the benefits we have is that we live out in the country.
Yeah.
We have a farm, and so there's always stuff to do, whether it's taking care of animals or gathering manure or helping get the gardens ready or weeding. So definitely living on the farm, living in the country on a small family farm with kids is very helpful for them.
And if you're interested in that topic, I did a walk talk titled "Where Should We Live?" and I talk about the benefits of country life, and I also talk about if I were to live in a suburb, how I would have the boys and have the kids live if we lived in a suburb or if we lived in a city. So the same benefits can be had in other places, but out in the country it's just different because the kids can just roughhouse during their playtime or work time. They learn to be tough. They get injured. They learn to deal with injuries. Military life is no problem.
One of the first things we moved down here years ago, we always lived in apartment complexes before we came down to the country. And I remember the first thing when the kids first got out of the car, they got out and they ran and they just started yelling. We had the 3 or 4 little ones. They started yelling. And I remember my first reaction was tell them, be quiet, shh. Because we're always living in this tight little apartment complex. And I remember you telling me, Dania, why are you telling them to be quiet? There's nobody here.
Yep.
And that was just at first, that was a big thing for me. Like the kids can really just yell and run and scream and no one's going to be affected by it. No one's bothered by it. And they do that. That's how they live. They go outside and they run and scream.
And they love country life too. Even the older ones, like Jonathan is in Charlotte in the city at college, and he looks forward to the day where he can finish school and finish his career work and settle back down in country life. So the key there is health and fitness.
Yeah.
And even with the kids, like when they get older, I've bought the kids weightlifting equipment, exercise equipment. I exercise. We try to set a good example for the kids with staying active, and fitness is always taken all of that energy out of them and put it to good use so that it doesn't distract church life, school life, other home activities and things like that, giving them a way to be healthy and fit.
Even a simple thing that people can do in a suburb, they have a basketball net outside.
Yeah.
They just spend an hour,
lifting
hour
weights.
and a half, with lifting weights. Just
running as teenagers.
Yeah, running. Yeah, the teenagers all run together.
The military promotes, you think about military fitness, it's push-ups, sit-ups, running, pull-ups. The kids, that's what they do. So just health and fitness. You have to get that physical energy out. You have to make the kids temperate and courageous. And that comes through play and work and injuries and overcoming challenges and things like that. And focusing on health and fitness every single day, at least 2 hours they have for plenty of physical exercise. So that's the 6th principle. The 7th principle, again, relates to that, and it's just the importance of focusing on our setting a good example. One of the principles that I always tell Dania, Dania will come to me complaining about a kid doing something bad or there's some problem. And what I always do, even to a fault probably at times, and we might argue about this a little bit, is I'll just ask what we're doing that's causing the problem, what we're doing as parents. And I'll tell Daniel, like, what do you expect? Look at what we did here. We didn't keep the morning schedule. Things were screwy here. We've had a couple of wacky days. What do you expect? Like, what do you expect the kids to do? And this goes back also to focusing on what's in our control. If we're not doing everything that we're supposed to be doing, how can we ask the kids to do what they're supposed to be doing? And so, a lot of these principles relate to one another, but this setting a good example in doing the things that we tell our kids are important. So, for example, my kids see me studying all day and all night. They see me working. They see the fruit of my work. They see the focus of my life. If I turn around and yell at my kids to spend more time studying, that's coming from a guy that they know is studying. The same thing with my wife. My wife, she's studying, she's working, she's helping me, she's busy, she's getting a meal ready, she's helping me with office work, she's helping the kids with their studies. She's doing her job and setting a good example. When she turns around to tell a kid to get to work, he's being told to get to work by a woman who's working harder than he is. Why don't you talk a little bit about times that you've been able to get on the kids because you work harder than they do as teenage boys? Can you talk about that?
Are you talking about like when boys were living here?
Yeah, you can talk about that.
Oh, there was just a couple times when we'd be working out in the garden or working in the farm, doing farm work, and I'd be pregnant or things like that. And we'd all be working. When you have garden work to do or farm work to do, you just have to get it done. It doesn't matter what your state is, you have to just get it done. And so we'd be doing garden work, and teenage boys would be complaining, and I'd be standing next to them with the hoe. We're goofing around and complaining, and I'd be standing next to them with the hoe, and I'd say, "Hey, look at me! I'm pregnant. I'm working. I'm doing more than you're doing, And they, how come you, with all their physically strong bodies, teenager can't keep up with me?" And so it's just things like that. You just have to be tough and be a good example to them, even if it's difficult, or even if they can see that you're undergoing difficulties, and they should be stronger and more physically able to do this work than you, and they're being weaker.
You cannot ask the kids to do things that you don't do. You cannot tell the kids that things are important that they see are not important in your life. They see your schedule. They see what you do at your free time. They see how you eat. They see how you sleep. They see how you work. They see how you study, how you pray. They see everything that you do. And when you turn around, if you try to tell the kids to do something that you don't do, mm-hmm. not only is it hopeless, mm-hmm. because they're not going to listen to you unless they're saints, mm-hmm. but you're revealing to them just how dishonest your character is and permanently harming that relationship. And
it even comes to times when sometimes you don't get a lot of sleep as a mother, sometimes you're really tired and you're really tempted to just like take a day off of school and just like rest. And, you can't. You just got to keep going. Once in a while you do. Once in a while you just can't keep going. But the biggest thing is just to, even if you're tired, just keep going and be a good example to them to just work through things and to keep working. Maybe there's something you need to do. Go take a walk together. Walk around the room as you're studying or something like that. But you have to keep pushing through. If you want them to be those kind of people that push through difficulties, then you have to do it yourself.
Yeah, and that also includes confessing your sins to the kids. Mm-hmm. That's one of the most influential things in my life with the kids has been times where I snapped at them, or I talked nasty to them, or I said something nasty, and they went to bed and I sat up feeling terrible about it, and I had to confess. And so even not just setting an example of doing everything right, mm-hmm. but also setting an example of how to handle mm-hmm. relationships when you do something wrong.
Yeah. Even as a wife, if I snap at my husband or say anything like that to you, and the kids can see it. The kids see, like, they know mom was wrong. I have to tell you that I'm sorry, but then also go tell them, I was a real jerk.
And in our society where the mothers are just, totally disrespectful to the husbands, constantly arguing and fighting, mm-hmm. and then those parents turn around, or those mothers turn around and ask kids to obey. It's just ridiculous. And the kids know that. The kids know it's a joke. The kids know, mm-hmm. if this is religion, then religion is a joke.
Right. Well, I even feel like that. If I feel like I'm being a bad wife, to go then to the other room and go yell at them to go obey me, I can feel in myself, I'm being, oh my goodness, I'm being a hypocrite. And usually I can either have to be quiet and just shut up and bear with what they're doing, or I have to make up with you and I have to tell you I'm sorry. And kids, I told Dad I'm sorry for that I was a jerk. Okay, now you need to listen to me,
Yeah. So good example. You see parents love to play this act that they're strict and they're like on top of these little kids and they're yelling at them about all these little details, yelling at them to do this, do that. And then you look at Dad, and Dad's like undisciplined, lazy, idle, but he's pretending like he's going to pretend he's a serious father by yelling at the kids and being down the kids' throats all day long. And mothers do the same thing, just always yelling at the kids, nitpicking every detail. And the mother herself is disorganized and slothful and, doing whatever she wants. And the kids, they're rational creatures. They see right through that hypocrisy. And that's the kind of stuff, most importantly, that hypocrisy is what causes to lose respect for their parents. And that's the big issue. When kids lose respect for their parents, it's game over for those families. So being a good example, not just of striving to do everything right, because Jesus said, be perfect. That's the standard. Not just striving to do everything right positively, but also when you're doing what's wrong, being a good example of taking the necessary steps to fix and acknowledge those things, to confess those things, so that your kids can see, all right, you know what? Dad screwed up, but he owned up to it and confessed it. And I know when I've confessed my sins to my kids, I can see in them a sense of relief. Like, Dad loves me. Dad can't go to sleep if he does something bad to me. And he came in and made that right. And I know that Dad loves me. So that kind of stuff, setting a good example. Before you ask the kid to do something, ask yourself if you're doing that thing. Because if you are, and the kid can see it's serious, it'll make it much easier for that kid to follow you. Just think about how Jesus moved people, was to go into town and say to the people, follow me. He didn't say, you need to do this, and you need to go do this, and you need to do that, and you... Jesus could say, follow me, and that's the way that you lead children to do what they should do. So setting a good example. Number 8, household order. And we've talked about this a little bit. Household order. When my wife and I got married, I was very serious about being a dad who was going to have my household in order. Daniel, why don't you tell, this is a funny and kind of embarrassing story, but why don't you tell a story about my effort to get our household in order from the beginning with my...
Well, you were a little obsessive. Well, our kids, Jonathan was strictly scheduled from the day he was born, pretty much. I mean, his 2-year-old days were scheduled from the time he got up till the time he went to bed, every hour what we were doing. So he had an orderly day from the time he was born. But when we were first married, you had made a family constitution for us of how we were going to live. I don't even know if we were married yet, but you had written it up for me, and it was our constitution, how we were to live. And I think I still have it too.
Yeah, we still have a copy.
And then but all throughout our early days, you always were making constitutions or different things like that, resolutions, things we were going to work on and change. And as a wife, sometimes it was hard, and I had to, but I wanted to obey. I wanted to be a good wife, so I usually tried to go along as much as I could. But and so you always were set that the husband is ahead, and you had all your responsibilities to do as a husband, and I was to obey, and then our children would obey both of us, and that's just how it's always been set.
And it sounds silly, those things sound silly, but the reason why I took it so seriously was because I was studying Xenophon, and I was studying the ancient Greek philosophers, they took household management seriously. Household management is government. It's like the founding organizational unit of society. And it's not so much that I think that I took it too seriously. I think that men take it, don't take it seriously enough. That how much work, how much planning and organization it really takes to establish a household, an orderly household where there's structure, there's social order, there's gender roles, there's responsibilities for everyone. Everyone's accountable, and it's a sustainable order. It's a responsible order. I have to work. I don't have time to nitpick over what we're having for meals or what's going on. I have to work. That's my primary responsibility. And for me to be able to have a household where my will as the head of the household is known and enforced when I'm not directly involved all the time, that's very difficult to achieve. And there has to be order established, like a government. And it's got to be, it can't just be like occasional conversations and things like that, or always putting out fires, constantly fighting with everybody. It's got to be set down almost as a law. And we used to make up schedules. We used to make up lists of procedures for how we were going to do things. SOPs, standard operating procedures, because you can joke about it and laugh about it, but what's the alternative? To not have anybody know what to do, to not have anybody know how we're going to do these things. And so, we work together early in our marriage to establish things like family schedule, to establish SOPs for how things get done. Everything from grocery shopping to the household routine. And having household order, establishing household order, because it's artificial, and partly artificial, partly natural, but partly artificial. Establishing that order when the kids are young so they grow up and they know it. And it's just how life works. And, now, 22 years into marriage, our kids know the household order. But in the beginning, there was no household order. It had to be established and cultivated and taught and maintained. And that's hard work. And that's work that fathers have to do, to establish household order. Next, the 9th principle. We're closing in on an hour here, so we'll keep chugging along. We're doing pretty good. We've got through 8 in 50 minutes. The 9th one that I emphasize with the kids all the time, is that school is children's full-time work or full-time job. We tell the children every day, school is your full-time job. And I'm going to talk about this a little because I have 7 sons, and I believe that boys should work hard in their schools, and I really lament how few boys there are who take studies seriously. And one of the errors that I see, that I get on my kids about all the time, is that boys think that school is not that important and they want to work. They'll say, especially my boys are hardworking, good-looking, rough, and healthy boys, and our neighbors are eager to employ my sons for work. And my sons love this idea of getting out of school to go work. And we're talking serious jobs where they're paid well. For me, in my opinion, that's an excuse to get out of your real work, which is to study. And it's something I learned. I actually learned this when I was out at Clear Creek Abbey, because the abbot gave me a commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict. And it explained that when St. Benedict taught ora et labora, pray and work, study was included in that work. But study was only acceptable when it was pursued as diligently as manual labor. So study is labor. And this is something I always try to emphasize with my students, that study is physical, intellectual work. You don't sit on a couch, drinking an iced tea, studying. Study is physical work. And when you look at old schoolhouses and old schoolmasters, boys were made to work in school. And that's something that in our culture we've lost. School today is for sissies. The boys play sports and laugh about their bad grades, while the girls are on the honor roll. Most of the top students I deal with in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy are girls. I don't see many high-achieving boys in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And we have to stress with our children that their full-time job as children is to study. Not to go find part-time jobs and all this junk that kids do. Their full-time job is to study. And I don't want to hear a boy tell me that he's a hard worker when he doesn't study. A boy who's a good student will also be a good worker. But a boy who doesn't want to be a good student, he also won't work, because school is just work. And school is your full-time job. And that's what we teach our children. So when you ask, how many hours a day should the children study? School is their full-time job. That's what they should do. They need to study as if study is work. And when you look at the classical Catholic curriculum, you're not going to make progress unless you work like it's a full-time job. I've told our college kids, I have to tell them this. It's called full-time school for a reason. They call it full-time studies. You're called a full-time student for a reason, because to accomplish the objectives of your studies, you need to devote full-time effort to it. So another principle that we've emphasized is that school is your full-time job, especially when you're a minor. Okay? The next one is one that you can talk about, Day. The 10th principle, little by little, bit by bit. Little by little, bit by bit. Why don't you talk about that principle?
Well, I've always said with the kids, little by little, bit by bit, that's how work gets done. And so it's always just kind of a process, like every day we're going to work. And we might not get the entire lesson done, we might not get a ton done, but it's the scope of things, it's the big picture, that over years and years and years, this little bit that they do every day is going to be great. It's going to be, the whole curriculum is going to get done, but it's just, or as much as they can get done, but it's going to be not by big heroic effort today, which isn't sustainable. There's no way you can do that.
Never happens like that.
But if we just do a little bit every day, they give me a good amount of work every day. We just persevere, and that's how they actually make it through that.
Yeah, when we talk to homeschool families who are struggling, it's almost always because the mother is breaking a bunch of these principles. She's asking things of the kids that are not realistic. She's putting pressure on them that is simply not sustainable. She's asking them to do things that are not in her control. She has a vision of what the kids' studies should look like, even though she's never done it herself. And they're simply trying to get a lot done and thinking that that's how you make achievement, by getting a lot done today. We're going to, it's back to school. We're going to organize the schoolroom. We're going to get everything organized. We're going to have new planners, new this, new that, back to school. We're serious this year. And in 6 weeks, it's back to chaos. And the reason why is because their expectation and plans are not sustainable. Because the way that real achievement gets made is little by little, bit by bit, multiplied by a long time.
And it's consistency too.
Yep.
It's just being that this is all we do. It takes a lot of contentment for mom, because sometimes we get stir crazy as ladies and we want to go do stuff. We want to go on a trip. Let's go to the park. Let's go do this. Go do this. And as mom, you really have to settle your soul. You really, really need to pray and calm yourself down. Be content in your house. Be content with your husband and your children right where you are. And stop wanting to go do stuff. Stop wanting to think you need to go see everybody and do things. And be content. Be home and be simple. and just set yourself at little by little, bit by bit. That's how work gets done. And you're just going to do this over a long course of time.
And just think about think about monks and nuns. That's how their life works.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why when people visit monasteries or convents, they feel like they're going to go crazy because it's just so boring. It's the same routine every single day. Every single day, it's the same routine. And yet that's how, throughout history, monks and nuns have accomplished so many extraordinary things, because they just do it little by little, bit by bit, over long periods of time. And that goes back also to the first principle, which is duty done is fireside to the soul. That's when you talk about that contentment, being content to stay put and keep things calm, let the kids make progress today, keep things consistent. Don't look for variety. Don't constantly change the schedule. Little by little, bit by bit, multiplied by many, many days is how things get done. And that takes the stress off. It makes expectations realistic, keeps everything positive. But the challenge there is the repetition.
Yeah, and just try to do it every day. Like don't take days. You don't need days off. You don't. You just need to keep doing the same thing. I mean, you may feel bored. You may feel like it's not very exciting, but you know what? That's how you will make progress. That's how the children will make progress. That's how your house will become orderly. And just be content. Just learn to be, and ask God to help you be content. You know?
The kids need you. Like one thing we say, Dania, is I say you need to be the pendulum. In the house. You need to be the pendulum. You need to be the source of everyday order. I may have to, my work life may be crazy one day. I may have tons of work, be up working overnight one day. My life, I can sort of absorb all the craziness. And then your role is to be boring. Your role is to be the pendulum that gives the kids the consistency and the order and the routine that allows them to get and that's hard that takes real discipline and self-sacrifice to just say, I have to be the one that kind of maintains this boring routine for the benefit of the kids' long-term studies.
Yeah, and this you may have to tell other mothers, no, we can't have all these outings, we can't do all these things, because you know what, this is more important. I have to be home with the kids. I have to have this consistency in their life every day. And
we're homeschooling. We're not a normal family. This isn't a day off. This isn't a play day. We're a homeschooling family. We have studies to do. And so little by little, bit by bit, having realistic expectations, not stressing out and making every day miserable, but realizing that the real key is to multiply the daily achievement by many, many days.
Well, one of the problems is when you take a lot of days off to go do things. Now, when you do come back to school, you're like, oh my goodness, I have to do 4 days worth of work today.
Yeah, and then you have homeschools following the school calendar, taking breaks for holidays and taking summer vacation, taking 3 months off of homeschool because the homeschool publisher is publishing material just for September to June. Why in the world is a homeschool family following the public school calendar? It makes no sense. And so little by little, bit by bit, multiplied by many routine days is how real achievement gets done. The next principle, something that we came across when we were first married, we found an old book. Who was it?
William Cobbett?
No, Cocker. It was Cocker's Morals.
Right.
Cocker's Morals was a book full of short little proverbs, moral sayings. And one of the moral sayings was, how many, by wise management of time, from low degrees, have mounted to sublime? How many, by wise management of time, from low degrees, have mounted to sublime? And when we were married, to put it in context, we were dirt poor. We had nothing. We got married. We had an apartment. We were studying at Rutgers University. My wife was finishing up a little before me because I had changed majors and put myself back a couple of years. But she was finishing up and she was going to start teaching at a Christian elementary school. And when we got married, we had no idea how we were going to pay our rent. We had no idea. I think what was it, $675 a month?
Something like that, yeah.
We had no idea how we were going to manage to pay that rent. We had no money. God always provided for us, and things, always worked out, but we had no money. And even when I was teaching, when we started to have children, and I was the only one making any money, and I was just a Christian school teacher, we were barely making any money. But what we had was time. And so even though we didn't have a lot of money, between the two of us, we had time. And that saying from Cocker's Morals, how many by wise management of time from low degrees have mounted to sublime. And so what we did have, time, we made good use of. And, with homeschooling, there are a lot of Christian families, young Christian couples, getting started in life who are in exactly the same place we were. They don't have much money. They have no idea what they're going to do 10 years from now. And yet, they get married, and the next thing they know, they're expecting a baby, and life just starts getting busy, and things go. And what young couples have to realize is that it's not so much that you need more money. You may have enough money to do everything that needs to be done, but the resource that you really need to be careful with is time. And that principle, how many by wise management of time from low degrees have mounted to sublime. That's another principle, not as much today, because our life and routine is pretty much well established now at this point in our life. But when we were young, just getting started with babies in the house, no money, careers just getting started, figuring out what we were going to do, time management was the key. And, one thing I can say that we did well is that we managed our time well between ages 20 and 30. And, today we reap the benefits of some of those decisions. But that principle, anything else you want to say about that before we go on?
I just thought of another principle that was...
Another one?
Yeah.
Well,
There's
go ahead.
Another principle that we always talk about is nothing human is
Oh,
foreign to me.
Yeah. Okay, we'll make that 13. That's pretty deep philosophy, so we'll save that for last. All right, the next principle, and this is another one that Christian parents, Catholic parents don't necessarily want to think about, but I think it's a real source of peace, and it's really helpful in just parenting through the years. And it's constantly meditating on a couple passages of Scripture that we need when things are not going well. So meditations on a few passages of Scripture, 2 actually, that are important when things are not going well. The first one is to meditate on Jesus' parable of the Prodigal Son. And we'll get into it in a little bit. To meditate on the parable of the Prodigal Son, especially when the kids are being bad. When the kids are being bad, you're going to go through times in the kids' lives where it's just dark. And we went through these times, especially when our kids got into their early teens, our eldest kids in their early teens, there were some dark days. And we could have easily gotten discouraged, and there were times when we did get discouraged. But meditating on the parable of the prodigal son always pulled me out of it, and always, encouraged me and kept me going. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then the other one, as parents, we say that our goal in parenting is that we want to raise our kids to love God. We want our kids to love God. I would sacrifice anything for my kids to love God. And yet when we think about what Jesus teaches, he says, those who are forgiven much, love much. Those who are forgiven much, love much. And if we put that into its context, those who sin much are those who are forgiven much. And those who are forgiven much are those who love much. And so the love of God has a certain relationship to our sinfulness. And when we have kids, we have this dream that we're going to keep them from ever sinning. They're never going to sin. We're going to watch over them 24 hours a day and never let them sin. Like their souls are these, pure, crystal clean pools of water that we're going to keep clean forever. And when they begin to do evil things and they begin to sin, sometimes we just don't know what to do with it. Sure, you bring them to confession, but they're still doing bad things and choosing bad things. And we feel like we're losing them because they're making bad decisions. And some of these can be really bad decisions. But then when we think about what Jesus says, when he says, those who are forgiven much, love much, you realize that this is just part of the Christian life. It's just how it works. And the kids have to be evangelized. They have to be taught that God is merciful, that God is forgiving. And this is one of the things that the church does extremely well, that the church doesn't get enough credit for, is really communicating to the kids in their dark days God's mercy. And we often criticize the church for being too soft and so soft. We wish sometimes that the priest would yell at the kids or get strict with things. But that may be our own error, because the church always errs on the side of mercy. And that's very important in the kids' lives. And in those dark times, meditating on the parable of the prodigal son, just to quickly go over the story, we have a father who has two sons. One of his sons is good, one of his sons is bad, and that right there is significant. A good father, good son, bad son. Same house, good son, bad son. Same father. His son is wicked. Asks for his inheritance so that he can pack up and leave. Takes half of his father's possessions, which is his inheritance, leaves the house, and blows it all on immorality. That's the prodigal son. Loses everything and ends up in the street. I mean, he's like the modern day junkie, left in the street, lost everything. We're talking prostitutes, today it would be drugs, it would be, who knows what. That prodigal son is sitting in the depth of his life, in the lowest, darkest place. And what saves him is the memory of the goodness of his father. He remembers how good his father's household was. And the goodness of his father inspires him to get up and go back home. And what it teaches us is that no matter how badly any of our children go astray or fall away into sin, the life that we live with them when they're home is what they're going to remember when they fall away. And we have to ask ourselves, is that memory of life at home good memory or bad memory? Because you can imagine what would happen to the prodigal son if he fell away and his mind was filled with bad memories of home.
He wouldn't want to come back.
Yeah. And so when our kids are struggling, or even before our kids struggle, we have to realize that the life that we provide for them, the relationships that we develop with them, the experiences that they have in our homes may be what saved them in their darkest times in life. And we hear so many stories about suicide and drugs and all these kinds of things. And you have to wonder how many of those kids, when they fell into the gutter, just had nothing to think back on, nothing to turn to. No good memory, no thought of going back home. And that thought of having one of my kids fall into sin, which I can't control, that's not my concern, because I can't control that. But what I do have the opportunity to control is what exists in that kid's mind and heart in that moment when he's in the gutter that can bring him back. And so always focusing on the story of the prodigal son, that Jesus tells us that story of the son returning home. And he says the father in that story is a symbol of God. And the son in that story, the prodigal son in that story, is a symbol of us. And that's just normal. It's a part of life. And, God forbid it happened to any of our kids. I mean, I obviously don't want that to happen. But we have to realize that it may happen, and it may just be the means by which they're led to a strong, saving faith that I would pay anything for. And if that's the route that it takes for the kids to love God and to be faithful, I would be happy 1,000 times to go through that. But the parable of the prodigal son and seeing his return and what prompts him to return home and realizing that's in our control. And then Jesus is teaching that he doesn't say those who never sin love God. He says those who are forgiven much love much. And so our kids are going to sin, and we have to evangelize them and teach them that Christ came into the world to save sinners. And they have to learn through experiencing all of the times that they fall and sin and receive good things from Christian people. They do bad things, and our kids have done bad things. They do bad things, and they're met with forgiveness. And over time, they're going to learn that their parents, the Christians, are good. And they're going to love us because of that always present readiness to forgive. Because the world is not going to treat them like that. And they learn that the hard way real quick when they get into adult life. So understanding that sin is normal in the Christian life, the church provides remedy for sin, and understanding that our kids need to be taught that when they sin, they simply need to confess their sins and amend their life, that God is merciful, the church is merciful, we're merciful, and we just want them to be happy and maintaining that attitude. That was the 12th principle, that meditating on the prodigal son and the idea that those who are forgiven much love much helped me in those times when our kids were struggling and it got discouraging to just be patient and just keep working. And those times came and went, Lastly, the last principle you brought up, that nothing human is foreign to me. This is an old philosophical saying, and I forget who said it. I'd have to look it up. But it was one that I started to talk about when I was studying in college. Nothing human is foreign to me. And that's just really just a principle of being able to figure things out, realizing that anything that we face is human, it's normal, and there's a solution for it, and it likely has already been handled in history, and most of the time when we face a difficult issue, we just have to know where to look to get counsel and to figure out what to do, because nothing that we face is new.
Well, this helped me. That principle that you taught me helped in the beginning of our marriage when we didn't have much money, and like you said, we had lots of time, and I needed to learn how to become a housewife and feed my family and clothe my family, but not having a lot of money, but having time. So I had to look. I looked at all kinds of old books. It was Google books were started coming around, and I went to the library. We had lots of good libraries back where we lived in Rutgers and up there, and so I would go to the libraries and I'd try to find historic books about housekeeping and how women managed their homes and how women managed their kitchens, and that principle, nothing human is foreign to me. I said, okay, these women have done this. Women have been much harder circumstances than I am. Women have done this. They know how to do these things, and these answers must be out there. And I would search all those old historic books to try to find how people did it, and because I had all the time to do that at the time, and I found that I learned how to make bread. I learned how to sew. I learned how to crochet. I learned how to do different things like that provided some of the needs that we had during those times when money wasn't there, you know?
Yeah, and another good thought that comes out of that is just that, and we've had to do this at different times. We've had to make risky Christian decisions where we had to step out of the path that everyone else is on and take a route that we had no idea what to do. And when we took it, we found that there were Christians who already lived that life and already did all those things. And, you know, just because it's a route that we had to take that was unpopular, it's a route that Christians have taken before. And, you know, for the sake of serving God, for the sake of fulfilling our own duties in life, we can't just keep walking with everyone else all the time. And we can't look like everyone else. We can't do everything like everyone else. We can't have everything that everyone else has. There are times where the decisions that we have to make come with consequences, and we have to be willing to learn to live differently, to take a step in a direction that our families never went in, that we've never been in. And we have to learn to do those things. And we have to realize that those moments in our lives where we have to step out of that path and do something different, what's different in our society is not necessarily different historically. And when we have had to take those steps, we've found Christians there able to teach us, not necessarily living today, but we found Christians there who had to make the same decisions and take the same side routes for the sake of good conscience. And we've realized that there's always somebody who's done it before. And you can find help and you can find advice and find instruction, no matter what weirdness you have to go through. And stuff like that comes up all through our lives as parents. So that's it. We ended up with 13 principles, things that have been really influential in our life as parents, in our life as homeschooling parents. 13 principles. As I said, there's no order to those to that list as we went through it. We just brainstormed and came up with a list. It's a lot of information. We're at an hour and 22 minutes right now. So it's a long talk, but I think that going through these principles will help us as we continue to move into the practical details. When we talk about practical things that we've done or that we do, I think that you'll understand more clearly the thinking behind them, the principles behind them, and you'll see that sometimes things may seem crazy, but they're really not crazy. They're principled, and there's a thought process behind them, but they're certainly different. And so as we get into practical details, we'll start in our next talk to start really getting into the details of homeschooling. And the reason I say we'll get into homeschooling is because I know we've already been asked several times to get into the practical details of what the kids study and do and how their studies are managed. And we'll get into those details. But I wanted to go through the principles first to kind of provide some sense of the reasoning behind things. Another topic that I'd like to take up, my wife has had 10 children, 3 of them born at home, taking care of 10 children. And I can say as a husband and father with 10 children, that in 22 years with 10 children, I have never had to take care of a baby. The babies were always cared for. I was always free just to work. And there's a lot of philosophy and principles and practices that my wife learned and followed through the years, that we studied together at times through the years to figure out how to manage things. And we're going to also spend some time talking about things like that, like how my wife managed babies through the years, how she handled pregnancies, deliveries, nursing, scheduling babies, getting babies trained to participate quickly into our family routine, things like that. So a lot of practical parenting stuff, but also some practical homeschool stuff. So I hope this is a helpful overview of some principles. I'd like to know from you if there are any principles that you'd like to suggest and add to this list, principles that you've already found helpful if you're a young family, or things you've been taught by older, wiser Christians who've given you good advice, or if you're an older, experienced parent, you probably share some of these principles, but you might have others. I'd love to hear what those principles are. Maybe we can collect a list of all of these principles that we've focused on and learned and have been helped by through the years. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions or would like to talk about anything in more detail, feel free to contact us. Our email address is mail@classicalliberalarts.com. You can comment on the YouTube videos if you're following this on YouTube, but we're easy to get in touch with. Email us, contact us on the Academy website. We hope that's helpful. God bless your families.